Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, Deputy Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and it's my privilege to welcome you to this afternoon's talk. Before we start, I have a few announcements. The talk kicks off our bi-weekly housing research seminar series, which will continue on Friday, October 1st, when Carlos Martin, the new director of the Center's Remodeling Futures program, will be speaking about building equity into federal investments for housing resilience. And then, of course, we'll continue roughly every 2 weeks after that. I also want to let you know about two other upcoming events. Next Thursday at 5 p.m., the center is co-sponsoring a debate titled, "Is Rent Control a Good Way to Protect and Stabilize Renters?" that will feature Lance Freeman, a professor of urban planning at Columbia, and Jenny Schutz, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program. And then the following afternoon, starting at 2 p.m., will be the kickoff of Hack-A-House 2021, hosted by Ivory Innovations and co-sponsored by the Joint Center and others. This is a nationwide competition in which graduate and undergraduate students from around the country, working individually or in teams of up to 5 people, have 24 hours to develop an innovative solution to a problem related to housing affordability. 3 of the entries, one in each of 3 categories, will receive a $3,000 prize. The other one will receive a $1,000 prize. You can find more information about the hackathon and other upcoming events on our website. If you're a Harvard student who wants to participate in the hackathon and doesn't have a team, please reach out to me directly. You'll find my contact information on the website. Now to today's talk. Last June, as it has for over 3 decades, the Joint Center released its annual report on the state of the nation's housing. Today, Daniel McCue, a senior research associate at the center, who for many years has led the team that produces these reports, will discuss some of the key findings from that report, which of course covers much of what's happened in the last year or so during the pandemic. Where the data allows, he'll also provide some updates on trends about key issues and challenges identified in that report. Dan will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have about 25 or 30 minutes of discussion based on questions you can submit via Zoom's Q&A function. We'll wrap things up no later than 1:15 p.m. Apologies in advance if we don't get to your question. As you can imagine, we often get more questions than we have time to answer them. And also, if you need it, I just want to note that we have enabled Zoom's automatic transcription feature. So if you want to see a more or less accurate transcript of what Dan is saying, please click on that. Dan, it's all yours. Welcome to kicking off the fall seminar.
Thanks, David. Hello, everybody. As I share my screen, I want to welcome you. And yeah, it's great to be kicking off the Friday research seminars with a look at the state of the nation's housing report, as you should see right now on your screen. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is kind of go through some of the major findings and storylines from this year's report, and give some updates where there have been some relevant new data updates since the report was published. We publish it every year in June. So a few things have happened since. So I'll try to get you up to date as much as possible, but we'll go through, just a second, go through now. Here we go. So the story of the state of the nation's housing in this year's report is really a chronicle of all of the impacts that the pandemic had on housing in 2020. And kind of where it leaves us in 2021, looking at, it left us off at first quarter of 2021, see where, what had happened and where we were. And what we saw was the for sale markets were red hot, still continue to be. Rental demand, signs of recovering, but significant distress, even though the markets were recovering, significant distress, millions behind on rents, millions still in forbearance, behind on their housing payments as homeowners. The distress was not only significant, but it was uneven. It was uneven by race and income. Along pretty much every measure of distress that we found had this unevenness by race and income level among households. And it was not, these were signs, levels of distress and unevenness and inequalities that have been long existing. And really, an overarching theme of the report is just how much the pandemic extended the inequalities that we had seen for some time prior to the pandemic. So let me begin. The story begins with the for sale markets, which are red hot. Over the past year, a surge in home buyer demand started in about mid-2020, sent home prices racing upwards. And you can see it here in the yellow, showing the home price appreciation. And then the blue line here shows the number of homes for sale. The inventories were dropping to historic lows. So price appreciation jumped from 4.5% as when the pandemic began in March, up to 10% in December, and which was the first double-digit rise, as you can see in this chart, since 2014, racing upwards. Even more recently, CoreLogic just reported annual growth in June of 17.2%. So home prices nationwide rising 17% year over year. They reported the highest level of price appreciation in the entire 45-year history of the index, began in 1976. And that, again, is the national average. Many markets described in the State Nations Housing Report were seeing even higher rates of appreciation. This latest report showing, data for June showed 34% price appreciation for homes in Idaho, 26% appreciation for homes in Arizona, and 24% in Montana. These are sky high rates of price appreciation. And the prices are bid up as the buyers are competing for a historically low supply of homes for sale. Markets are tight. The inventory of homes for sale, shown here in blue, was below two months of supply in late 2020 for the first time on record. We know that 6 months of supply is generally seen as a balanced market, and we haven't seen that for some time now. So what's happening? It's really, on top of the low supplies, we've seen a combination of low interest rates here in that low line, kind of dipping down into 2020. Low interest rates, increased savings, desire for larger homes with the increased working from home, the need for space. And the longer term story, the demographics of a large millennial generation at prime ages for buying homes, would have happened anyway, but it happened, during the pandemic and fed into the rising demand. A lot of people figure now is the time, to make the jump into home ownership with interest rates so low. 30-year interest rates held below 3% from July 2020 through February of 2021, and then are back below 3% and held there since about May. So really, as we see here in this chart, we see prices at the top going up, interest rates at the bottom trending down, and payments really holding steady. So really being able to get much more house for the payment. So that's been really bidding up prices. And really seeing the demand. Homeownership rates actually rose through the pandemic, as far as we can tell from the surveys available, and the greatest increases in homeownership rates among the young adult age groups, the ones getting into making the jump into home ownership. New single-family home sales were up 20% in 2020, the highest level since 2006. So big time demand for buying homes. And here's a look at construction. So construction levels, amidst all the demand, construction levels also ratcheted up, largely on the strength of single-family homes, but multifamily construction remained high as well. So even though we do have a significant shortage of housing, construction levels are running high. Since mid-2020, single-family construction is running at a pace of about 1 million homes per year for the first time since 2008. Total housing starts up 7%, highest level since 2006 as well. So really building a lot of homes, but a lot of catch up to do from all the years of low levels of construction. And where's that going? We've heard a lot about the suburbs, pulling demand, and there is demand in the suburbs, but like I was saying about these longer term trends in millennials reaching the age of where it's been normal for people to form families and move from cities to suburbs. We've seen this trend of increasing household growth in the suburbs prior to the pandemic. So here's a look at what we were looking at in terms of spatial demand heading into the pandemic. And we see a real acceleration of household growth in the suburbs of large metropolitan areas and small metropolitan areas. These are the same places that, you know, were largely noted as, you know, seeing a big surge in demand during the pandemic, but it's not completely a pandemic story. This is kind of extending trends that we had been seeing prior to the pandemic. So we shift over to rental housing. And in rental housing, we see 2020, the vacancy rates here by the type of neighborhood. And we see a tale of pretty much two markets. On one side, you have the extreme weakness shown in high vacancy rates, the surge in vacancy rates in blue here for rentals in prime urban areas. Vacancy rates, you know, largely high-end units, the densest, most expensive city neighborhoods. When the pandemic hit, vacancy rates for these areas rose from 7% here to 10% by the end of the year. At the same time, suburban rental markets saw continued tightening, vacancy rates falling throughout the year, reflecting a general increase in demand towards more suburban areas over the year. But the story is not over for urban rental markets. You can already see here in this chart, vacancy rates going down by the first quarter of 2021. It's likely to continue as businesses and offices begin to reopen. Demand for the proximity to urban areas and the amenities that urban areas carry continues to go up. And we see that even more here in a look of supply and demand. Supply is the more smooth line of construction units coming online. And the lighter blue line is a little bit more jumpy, but you can see that's the new occupied apartments. So we see a little dip in growth in rented apartments that happened right as the pandemic hit. But there was a pretty big rebound by the end of 2020 and early 2021 of household growth in renter households. So a big increase in demand already. And then we have, here's the update, first update for you, going all the way up at the latest mark of 500,000 units, occupied units, additional occupied units this year than a year ago in the second quarter. So a big surge in demand. So we had seen kind of a rebound in demand, and now we see all of a sudden demand far outstripping supply for the second quarter. So making up for some of the lost ground over the pandemic, but really putting pressure on rents and vacancies. And here we see rents back in the first quarter. We see the rebound in rents kind of mirroring that rebound in demand. These only continued, and we don't have the second quarter data, but rents continue to rebound. RealPage just recorded record high rent growth in the second quarter of 2021, and record high occupancy, so record low vacancy rates for rental units. So all the rent reductions that we saw over the past year are evaporating. As demand is surging, rents are surging once again. So surging rents continues to add pressure to households that are, the significant number of households that are under financial stress. So here's a look at the share of households behind on housing payments. We see still, when the report went out, 17% of all renter households were reporting being behind on rent. And the financial distress is disproportionately felt here among renters and people of color. Shares behind on rent rise from 17% to 21% of Hispanic renters and 29% of Black renter households reporting being behind on rent in the first quarter of 2021. The data since then, second quarter, has not declined very much. So overall, we still have we still have 14% of all renter households behind on rent, and still we have 1 out of 5 Hispanic renters and 1 out of 4 Black renters nearly behind on rent. So the racial disparities continue according to the latest data that we have. But it's not all renters. Measurable levels of distress remain among homeowners as well, again, with the same racial disparities among those behind on rent and also behind on housing payments, but also among those who have mortgages in forbearance. It is still nearly 2 million homeowners with mortgages in forbearance at last. As last we know from the latest data. One of the major themes in our report is how much the financial distress during the pandemic disproportionately affected low-income households, and it was largely mirroring and largely caused by the amount of burden that so many households already faced going into the pandemic. So here's a look at the housing cost burdens heading into the pandemic in 2019. High shares of households with low and moderate incomes already burdened. 82% of renter households with incomes below $25,000 a year burdened by rents. Total of 11 million renter households paying more than 30%, and 8 million renter households, 8 million low-income renter households paying more than half of their incomes on rents. As we've seen over the past year, dedicating so much income to housing affects the ability of millions of cost-burdened households to build the savings they need to have the ability to weather a financial storm. And it put millions of households in a position where even a minor loss of income could put them at risk of losing their homes. Here's a sense of some numbers behind the sheer differences, dedicating differences in wealth, the ability of households to dip into savings to pay for rent, given the loss of a job. The unequal impacts of the pandemic highlighted the extreme inequalities in wealth. Renters, low-income renters, and households of color at an extreme disadvantage. A typical homeowner had 40 times the wealth of renters, and bottom quartile renters here having less than $2,000 in total net wealth. We also see the differences by race and ethnicity. The median wealth of white households over 5 times that of the median Hispanic household and 7 times that of the median Black household. Also, noted in the report, surveyed by the Federal Reserve found that just 45% of Black adults and 47% of Hispanic adults would have enough cash to pay for an unexpected expense of $400, compared to 72% of white adults. But $400 is much less than the expected need rent that or mortgage payment that would be due at the end of each month. So precarious wealth situation for many. The household wealth and home ownership are so closely tied together. For many, the house is where most of the wealth is kept. So this makes reducing the wide gaps in homeownership rates by race and ethnicity a major policy issue that we highlight in the report. Here we see how at last measure, the Black-white gap remained at fully 29.9, almost 30 percentage points in 2019. The gap between Hispanic homeownership rates and white homeownership rates was also 24 percentage points in 2019. The Black-white gaps were wide across both income and age groups and remain widest among households in the prime home buying years, suggesting there's much work to be done to increase access to home ownership and close the gaps among the younger generations so they can build wealth. The report concludes by discussing how, in order to make meaningful improvements to housing affordability and to address the many challenges worsened by the pandemic, policymakers at all levels of government really must work together to do a number of things. First, reduce barriers to producing modestly priced homes in a range of communities. They must reduce the many persistent racial and ethnic disparities in the issues that we've noted here and in the report. Housing cost burdens, home ownership, housing wealth, all challenges that were reinforced by the pandemic. And lastly, the challenge to expand rental assistance and other efforts that have proven over the past year to be so important in keeping economically vulnerable households affordably and stably housed. These are the programs that really only reach a fraction of those that qualify. So extending the reach of those programs is really going to be key to make a meaningful and lasting improvement to this persistent challenge of housing affordability that we talk about every year in this report. Before I end this presentation, just wanted to highlight all the housing challenges that we talk about in the report go beyond affordability. One of them, one of the major challenges we see is in the face of climate change and the challenge of increasing the resiliency of the housing stock in the face of the dramatic impacts of climate change. So we have some indicators of this. I mean, here we see how the number of billion-dollar natural disasters outlined by the NOAA is growing, actually hit a record in 2020. So we can see here that it's just getting more and more frequent. These disasters hit all parts of the country. We're not just talking hurricanes, but it's hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, hailstorms, snow and ice storms, forest fires, things that hit and have impacted every part of the country. So the report kind of highlights this as a challenge, policy challenge, an increasingly important policy challenge that, like so many other challenges, disproportionately affects low-income households and households of color and renters. And we also discuss how the need to be both proactive as well as reactive in efforts to increase the resiliency of the housing stock, to mitigate, to prevent these impacts from being so widespread and so dramatic. So as I leave, I want to encourage you to kind of peruse the website for the report, where we have the ability to look at all of these issues, or as many as possible, with local data to see how these issues are playing out around the country for those looking at a specific area. We have a number of interactive maps and copious amounts of data and data tables that we make available. And also, to be further immersed, we do have online a discussion of the event that happened at the event, a panel discussion of the event that happened when we released the report, that I find helpful to go back to and hear additional kind of points of view and reactions and ways in which all the results in this report are grounded and put to work by the experts who we talk to. So with that, I will close down this slideshow and answer any questions that have come up in the chat, and I can give you a few minutes to enter a question that you might want to ask. I see there's a number of them.
And we can curate those for you. So
that would help.
Yeah.
Give me a second.
Oh yeah, I was going to say thank you. And there actually were a bunch there. Maybe can we start with a couple of things that I think are just particularly timely. The first is, what's your estimate of, or what's your sense of the impact of the end of eviction restrictions in one way, shape, or form at some point in time? And I guess related to that, we know that when the original report came out, the federal aid for renters had really just recently been passed. And is there any sign yet that has gotten out to the point where it's having any effect?
Right. Well,
I'd like to start out with the easy ones, by the way.
Well, let me begin my answer by saying this. You know, the eviction restrictions and moratoria were big. They had a big impact. You know, I think I saw on Eviction Lab, you know, an estimate of the moratoria in general, leading to it was like stopping 1.6 million. I think is that's the right number. 1.6 million evictions didn't happen because of the moratoria, which is huge. I mean, it kept people in their houses in a trying time that continues to be trying. And yeah, so I think they're big as they, you know, as they expire. I think we're going to, you know, see significant problems as one would expect. So the policy world is looking to kind of extend these protections, and we're finding, you know, as this report will show you, these, you know, the challenges aren't all pandemic based. I mean, there are significant challenges, significant pressures pushing towards eviction, you know, all the time. And yeah, so, you know, the hopes are that the things that we've learned and how to, you know, use that time, right, that we get through the eviction moratorium to give people time to get that money, to get the rental assistance, the combination of the, you know, the eviction moratorium and the rental assistance. It's still needed. We haven't gotten very much. It was like 3 out of the 46 billion intended for, you know, rental assistance has been allocated. So, you know, so I think the answer, as I would see, is we need more time. So for that money to get out, because it's slow, it's difficult. There's a lot of hoops to jump through, and a lot of states figuring out how to do this. So I guess hopefully that's a little picture of how I see what's happening now. Yeah. We need a little bit more time because the pressure's there.
Right, and I know that this is data that's been hard. There've been a couple questions about the impact of unpaid rent for landlords, particularly for, you know, the small kind of mom and pop landlords. And I can't recall if the report touched on that, but certainly some other Joint Center research has touched on that. Could you speak to that for a second?
Yeah, and you know, I think we lean heavily in this report for that topic on the surveys by Avail and the partnership they had with, I think it was the Urban Institute, but some interesting data there in terms of surveys of small landlords, and yeah, pointing, you know, the fact that small landlords, you know, are more likely to have low-income households as tenants. We did see in the report, you know, how these small landlords really took a big hit on their incomes, and especially for those who, you know, those who, if you only have a few units, you know, one tenant not being able to pay rent or not paying rent makes a big dent on your income. And so we have, I don't remember the exact numbers, but some pretty hefty amounts of missed rent reported by small landlords, which as a percentage of their income, as their ability to, you know, impacts their incomes. Not, you know, a lot of small landlords are low income households themselves, and you know, putting enough strain to make, you know, making assistance work for the landlords, you know, a high priority as well in these assistance programs. So hits both ends.
Yeah, and I would also point folks to Elijah De La Campa, who's a research affiliate of the Joint Center. We just recently published a paper of his that was based on surveys of landlords in 10 cities around the country, and basically confirming everything you just said, that this has hit particularly hard to the landlords with relatively few holdings. Circling back to your discussion about demand, there was an interesting question about where do we think the surge in demand was coming from, and the questioner, I believe, posed, you know, was it mainly from millennials and the formation of households there, or is it you know, basically the need to get people who are experiencing excuse me, homelessness off the streets, or is there anything you have been able to tease out of the data as to where the demand is coming from?
Right, and how demand was so high in a time that was so challenging, right? I mean, because what we're starting to see is, strong demand for home ownership, strong growth in homeowner households, and also strong demand in rental and strong growth in rental households, which means overall a big would have to be a big jump in overall households, right? Overall household formation kind of building. So, short term, see a lot of households that kind of got delayed from forming last year, coming into forming households now, in the position to form households this year, adding on to all those who were going to form this year anyway. So we're kind of layering on levels of demand at this point in time, through as employment growth and more young adults have jobs, more jobs are becoming in person. So people who maybe graduated last year and got a job in a different city could stay at home with their parents for a year. Maybe that's adding to the urban rental demand now, is that kind of need to be near work is surging. So have that on that side. On the homeowner side, again, the big picture issues mixing with the kind of shorter term trends, with the shorter term trend being this drop in interest rates and the desire for more space, necessity maybe for more space, and increased savings from not being able to spend money on a lot of a lot of things like vacations and things. That the savings amounts that really shot up and continue to be high, put a lot of people who are thinking about homeownership into a position where now's the time, I guess. It's just, as long as we can find a house, which is harder and harder, it made now, or last year, since probably like April of last year, made it the time to kind of go and buy that house. And interest rates have remained low. It's just the inventories have continued to be low, which is pushing prices up. So increasingly, at the time of production or publication, we were saying, the higher income renters are kind of, that were going to be homeowners eventually anyway, maybe a year or two from now, all kind of jumped in at the same time. But now prices are so high that prices are barriers. I think things are still tight, but the opportunities are going down, as we can see from this. Prices can only rise at 20% for so long until you're starting to price out a large number of potential buyers.
I mean, it does seem like you showed production numbers, which are some of which are, if not near record highs, certainly for recent years, quite high. And I know that you also do demographic projections, particularly about households. Is there a point where the relatively high numbers for supply are going to intersect with some demographic trends where you would expect price growth to moderate, the supply of units for sale to get closer to that 6-month benchmark? And
yeah, I don't know. I mean, what we have in the report, right, are the kind of long-term trends, and to see how things are shaping up. So I think it depends. It depends. One of the big benefits of all the kind of local market level data we have, that we publish with the reports, is you can kind of look to where the actions of the specific market. So yeah, so I don't know. What we do say in the report, and what the driver, it continues to be true, is the kind of low interest rates kind of feeding into price increases. We have a rebound in jobs and incomes, an increase in savings. All these things are pointing to continued high demand, and the slowdowns we're seeing is really on the prices and supplies not being able to keep up. So yeah.
One thing, could you talk a little bit about what we know about what is getting built, both on the single family and the rental side, particularly in light of what we know or what we think is happening with materials costs? The price of lumber has been all over the place. But it seems like are we actually building the kinds of houses that, given what the market demand looks like, are going to fill some of the gaps that you're concerned about?
Yeah, well, I think, the report does, go over the many kind of increases in materials costs, which have, kind of fluctuated, come down a little bit since publication. Still, the kind of pipeline issues and remain, taking a long time to get materials and to get things from refrigerators and things. Time is money. Time raises costs on a lot of things. So all of these kind of impediments to construction, not even including the regulatory impediments, but we're talking about just kind of the materials and the labor costs, are really kind of making it harder to build, to build at a lower price point, right? So all of these things, the supply helps, but the ability to kind of build at a lower price point gets squeezed. So it's kind of challenging. You mentioned also kind of what we're building, and I can talk a little bit about some of the things we're talking about in the report. Was the construction, like single family rental construction, going up as a reflection of both increasing desire to live in the suburbs, the lack of rental options in the suburbs, or multifamily rental in the suburbs, or in certain neighborhoods. So putting increased demand and tightness in the single family rental market, compounded by the tightness in the homeownership owner occupied market. Really kind of, we're seeing a homes getting taken out of the single family rental market, because, for owner occupancy, because those opportunities are there with the price increases. But really, the single family rental market's driving construction really still relatively low, when you look at the size of the number of single family rentals being built every year, compared to which, it's about a third of all rental units are single family. So it's a big part of the rental market. It's really affected by the tenure shifts. And so if people are being priced out of suburban homeowner opportunities, and suburban rental opportunities are disappearing because that market is shifting to home ownership. We're losing stock to homeowner stock. It's again putting constraint on the amount to which renters can seek opportunities in suburban areas, as looks like it's being increased higher demand.
Dan, there are a couple questions that have come in about the racial home ownership gap. It's not something you spoke about in your presentation. It's obvious it is something that is covered in some detail in the report and some of the other work the center's been doing. And could you just talk a little bit about the magnitude of the gap and what, given what we know about the gap, what might be some policy interventions to address that gap?
Yeah, let me see here. This might give me an opportunity to go back to that slide, right, that I had from the report showing those gaps, if I can.
While Dan is doing that, I want to note that corporate ownership of small rental properties is actually the subject of the last talk in this semester's housing research seminar. Adam Travis, who is a doctoral student in sociology, who's been looking at this, will be presenting some really interesting new research on that. Patterns of ownership in the 50 largest metro areas. Back to you, Dan.
Okay, so I think you should see now the slide that went over on the homeownership rate gaps. One of the, talking about, this is something we've been covering for a long time in the State and Nation's Housing Report. It really kind of was highlighted in our 30th anniversary report a couple of years ago, by a fact that continues to this day to be true, is that the white-black homeownership rate gap is as high as it's ever been. It's only gotten worse over 30 years, which is a poor sign for kind of efforts to address the white-black homeownership rate gap. But there's and the gaps exist across age groups. The fact that there's a gap, for young households is what I was kind of mentioning was we do this by age. You can see how the gap is particularly large for young and first-time homebuyer age households, which kind of seeing how this will play out in terms of the next generation or the current generation, so helping first-time homebuyers of color to really address these gaps. And so we comment a little bit about the proposals for first-time homebuyer assistance to really bridge the down payment gap, the lack of wealth, and the kind of generational lack, differences in wealth due to this legacy, these long-standing gaps in home ownership rates, where which has left so many generations out of this extreme wealth building opportunity that is home ownership. So I think it's a big policy effort that we underscore and we try to highlight every year. This year in particular, all of the facets. The latest data in the homeownership rate gap, where shows it fluctuating a little bit, but still really near 30-year highs in terms of the you can see from this chart how strikingly different the homeownership rates are by race, and yeah, so a big challenge.
Again, for viewers, another good reason to join the Joint Center blog. There's a paper coming out soon on thinking about learning from other international experiences on first-time homebuyer assistance programs, which look like, if designed carefully, could play a role in helping close that racial homeownership gap. There's one paper coming out quite soon, and another that's in the works. So look for that. Dan, there've been a bunch of questions, not only about the single corporate investment in single family rentals, but in general in the rental market. And I'm wondering if you can speak to anything that you've been able to tease out of the data on whether and to what extent the ownership patterns have changed for larger multifamily, particularly the influx of larger investors.
Let me think about that one. I'm trying to think of where in the report we kind of approach that. The institutional investors is in terms of, I think this report covers that most in talking about kind of the returns, the investment returns, and the cap rates that are being driven down, and the returns that are being seen, and the continued pretty high transactions volumes in multifamily that we discussed in the report. But I mean, I guess one of the over the past year, the multifamily investors that we covered, the owners anyway, really being squeezed by higher costs from people being in their units so much longer, a lot more wear and tear, a lot of higher costs, had kind of a balance between increased vacancies and higher rents, or higher or lower vacancies and rents. So just seeing the balance of that has really meant that summed into, there seems to be continued interest in rental, multifamily rental as an investment, because even at a lot of the very kind of what seem like low return rates, it's the comparable investments are getting you even lower rates, and so that so I think there's still a lot of money out there that's flowing into multifamily, that's keeping kind of costs of money really low for the investors. But so I think that's been the ability to kind of get debt at a low cost, or it has been a bright point for multifamily owners amidst challenges to the balance sheet and some losses and some increased costs. So, that's about the extent of what we would discuss in the report. I think a lot of the data is hard for us to come by, but.
Yep. I have two questions. I'll ask them quickly, but one of which has got both related to sort of supply and demand. I mean, the first is, what's your sense of what we now think is happening in terms of location choices related to COVID? There was the original what looked like a massive outflow from the cities, but it looks like you're showing that might not have stuck. So I'm wondering, how do you think ultimately COVID will affect demand for housing in cities versus suburbs, and also the kind of superstar cities, the New Yorks, San Francisco's, Boston versus I'm not sure other cities don't want to be called not superstar cities, but certainly not the highest demand cities.
Right. So the report does cover, the locational aspects of demand, and as I showed in an earlier chart, I won't go back to it now, but there's a few spatial issues that we can say. First of all, was kind of the underlying kind of trend of increased demand for suburban, suburbs and large metros, and smaller, growth in smaller, lower cost metros, due to issues of affordability, issues of the stage of life that a big generation of millennials are in now, which is normal. And we have papers on our website kind of talking about that aspect of it, the kind of underlying kind of forces at play that are pushing people there. So that's, pre-pandemic. During the pandemic, we saw, you see in this report, a significant jolt, taking away a lot of demand in urban, but really superstar urban areas. New York, San Francisco saw a big hit to demand as kind of construction went on. So that really kind of hurt, hit them on both sides of it as supply kept going on, a loss of demand. I think it really hit rents and vacancies more because of the continuation of the supply additions. But I think that will only kind of help these areas house more people in the future and kind of retain this demand that is sure to happen. So I think demand does seem to be happening in a widespread demand, right? Suburban growth continues. Urban growth seems to be rebounding. A lot of reasons to live in cities besides being close to work. And I think, I don't know, it gets into speculation a little bit on what's going to happen going forward. But I mean, I think ultimately people are going to be at the margins, those who find themselves not tied to their jobs and living a certain place because of their jobs, but maybe they're tied to those places for other reasons, schools or stuff. But I think on the margins, a shift toward areas that people demand, that are in higher demand, higher amenity areas is going to be is likely, right? Yep. No matter where it is, it could be within a city. It could be areas that you wouldn't have been able to get to work from, but now you can. And so it doesn't have to be a suburb, but I think ultimately the trends are suburbs have been growing for space, increasing space at affordable prices. But those are things we continue to study. You can check back at the next Save Nations Housing and see, because we don't really have too much data to show yet, but we will continue to get more and more of it.
I seem to remember, and I can't remember, at some point, I think it was in the summer, you actually wrote a blog looking at what happened to millennials, and the data seemed really clear that there were a bunch of millennials who, at the beginning of the pandemic, moved in with their parents, and 3 to 6 months later, left, and that was fueling at least some of the demand in housing. I remember looking at that graph and just being stunned.
Right, surprising how quick the exit out of parents' homes was last fall. But I think that seems to be continued. Right now, we're at a point where we see kind of evidence of a big surge in household growth, a big surge in household formation, and we're trying to figure out where that is, how to show that, how we can see that better. But all indications point to significant growth in renter households and significant growth in owner households. And it does seem likely that, we just have a lot of demand that was pent up, adding on to kind of a robust period. So that seems to be what's affecting the rental market, the rents for net, but that's another thing we're going to keep our eye on. But I think that seems the likely scenario right now.
Dan, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to wrap up really with two policy questions, one at sort of the state local level, and then probably end with one at the federal level. There was a really interesting question about the ways that state and local regulation affect land use supply, coming from apparently a viewer on the West Coast, where Oregon has essentially banned single family zoning and requiring, depending on the community, duplexes or fourplexes. There is similar legislation sitting on still Governor Gavin Newsom's desk in California. We've seen other pushes in a bunch of places for things like ADUs. I know it's hard to quantify this, but do you have a gut sense of how important this kind of legislation is? That we're not totally eliminating, we're eliminating single family zoning, but we're not kind of getting rid of it entirely, but at least allowing some increased density in urban areas. How important might that be?
I think the report kind of highlights it as important but not sufficient, I guess, on its own. And thinking of in terms of those events, the report kind of catalogs a bit the importance of local barriers on restricting development in lots of different areas. So putting a lot of the blame on state and local regulations, but also kind of seeing what the role of the federal government has in that too, right? The carrots and sticks that we're seeing from Washington too on these ends, and could see more of, right? And so giving more incentives to open up zoning to local areas, if local areas zoning is so important, and it is. So I guess the report would highlight the actions that need to be taken at all state, local, and federal levels, whether it's actually enacting the laws or giving incentives for those who can to do it, or giving some kind of, I don't know, penalties or penalty-like things where you don't get don't get as many of the nice things if you don't if you have some, because if anything, we've seen how so many of these affordability challenges that we're seeing is due to a lack of supply. And I think more and more that seems to be popping up as a clear reason for so many of these extreme challenges, is the shortage. Thinking of the National Low Income Housing Coalition's affordability gaps and how few houses, something about 30 something houses, affordable and available rental units for every 100 extremely low income household. Such a significant need is out there for more affordable and available housing units.
Your comments lead me to risk going off on a slightly different direction, but we have not talked about people experiencing homelessness. And what, and I know this is an extraordinarily hard thing to measure, but what was the sense that emerged from the report as to the interplay of these, the lack of supply, and the pandemic's economic impact? How did that seem to affect the number or nature of people experiencing homelessness?
Right. I mean, first of all, on the positive side, we saw that the positive benefit of housing assistance in kind of preventing homelessness. Right. The benefit of having your payment covered, or having housing your rental unit either in a publicly owned or a subsidized unit where it can be determined that you kind of won't be evicted, right? The eviction moratoria were easier to kind of enact and quicker to enact on assisted and affordable units that the government played some sort of role. But still, the need, and the thing that struck me in the chart that we have there is on unsheltered homelessness. And not so recent past, we've been talking about all the advances and all the positive news in the fight against homelessness. The new resources, the new knowledge of what works, the new models that are proving effective, the housing first type models, and the kind of proof that they're working. But what we saw is the advances are slipping, and we didn't see a completely positive story. And it wasn't just this year. It was we saw this year unsheltered homelessness increase, but it's been increasing for 5 years. We point out in our thing. So it's gone up by 50,000 people over the last 5 years. 50,000 more people in unsheltered homelessness. So it's a growing problem that we need to get a better handle on it, and we know much more as to how to fix it. It seems by so many as a fixable problem, because it's been done, and so there's new opportunities that have sprung up. The kind of assistance of unused motel, hotel rooms, using for shelters that became available in the pandemic, and were used, ways to kind of extend that for housing first models to get homelessness, people experiencing homelessness on their feet, or a stable place. So it's kind of like this year's report was really kind of saying, all right, let's not let this slip. The numbers are creeping back up, so policy-wise, maintaining stable sources of funding for these things, so that people know how to plan for it, that these things can be kind of done, and that the programs are going to be a stable source of funding for years to come. Things that we know work and know have been beneficial. So I think that was something that we say about homelessness in this year's report.
Well, somewhat indirectly, and thank goodness, I think you've answered a bunch of the kind of a question about where are some places that federal policy does or can, could help, and this is clearly one of those. I get this, as a wonderful sort of ability to watch the report get prepared, to sort of kibitz and throw in my suggestions. And one of the things that has always struck me, and it strikes me again in your comments today, is every paragraph in the report represents a whole line of extensive research that has to then be distilled down to one paragraph or one of the many slides that you came. And then today, you've had to dig down, not knowing always exactly what you were going to get asked. And it just underscores for me what a significant piece of work this is, how important it is for the center for trying to frame the debate. The conversation could continue. It won't continue here, but it will obviously continue. I know right now the center's working on its every other year rental report, and then come January, we will turn again to a State of the Nation's housing report, and hopefully begin to talk about what housing is going to look like as we hopefully emerge from the pandemic. And we look forward to having you back here about this time next year to again summarize. Thank you.
And before we go, let me thank the whole SON team. It wasn't me here. I'm answering all the questions, but others on the team probably would have answered the questions much better than I would or that I did. But just the whole research team here is responsible for this report, which we were all very proud of, and they did an excellent job this year. So I want to make sure that everyone
duly and correctly noted. Well, thank you to you and the entire team for this just really important piece of work, and thanks for taking the time to both present it and then field a whole variety of questions. Look forward to seeing folks again, still unfortunately online, in 2 weeks for the Housing Research Seminar. Don't forget about the hackathon, and don't forget about the debate on rent control that we're co-sponsoring next week. And thank you all for joining us.